Today I'm going to tell a story from the Dhammapada commentary. It concerns another of the very important episodes of the Buddha's life, one that didn't happen to fall on Vaisakha. It actually fell on the full moon of the month of Asali, so it's called Asali Puja, at the beginning of the rains retreat. This is the Buddha's ascent to Tawatingsa heaven and is teaching the Dewas in Tawatingsa. The story begins some time before that with a great storm high in the Himawan mountains, which lie to the north of the human dwellings in Jambudvipa. It's a place of magic and wonderful things. And this storm was so terrible it tore up a great sandalwood tree by the roots and tossed it into the Ganges River. And this sandalwood tree was carried down the Ganges over many waterfalls and rocky passages and beaten to a pulp and busted to pieces. And one large chunk that had been polished by the constant pounding to a beautiful red color and a smooth surface, as if it had been sanded many times, washed ashore just at the spot where the royal treasurer of one of the cities was taking a bath. And this thing washed up on shore. He saw it, what a wonderful, beautiful piece of wood. I must find something good to do with it. And he was a wealthy man and a well-educated man, and he had a rational, skeptical bent of mind. And at that time, there were many holy men and preachers and philosophers traveling around in India. And many of them were claiming to be fully enlightened, claiming to be arahant. And this treasurer thought, well, maybe I can use this to find out who is really arahant. And he had his workmen in his abode grind it and polish it and make a beautiful sandalwood bowl out of it. And he hung that on the top of a bamboo pole 60 cubits high. And he announced in the town by beat of drum, this sandalwood bowl will go to whatever arahant can manifest enough psychic power to levitate in the air and take the bowl. And we'll see who's the real deal. And all these various holy men, that they wanted to acquire this bowl, but none of them could manage to actually levitate. Although they put it about, well, we would, but we're not going to demean ourselves for such a unworthy purpose. One of them, Nagantha Nataputta, who often appears in the stories and with a slightly comic twist, he's one of these holy teachers. He cooked up a scheme with his disciples, and they went to him and a group of his disciples went up to this place where the bowl was at the top of a pole, and he said to the treasurer, he said, I would easily fly up and take the bowl, but I think it would be unseemly for me to display psychic powers like that. And so I think you should just recognize that I'm the superior one and give me the bowl. And the treasurer said, no deal, you have to fly up and get it. So then he withdrew with his disciples a few paces, and as they prearranged with his disciples, he struck this pose where he had one foot and one arm in the air, so like Superman, up and away, and his disciples cried out, "No, master, no, don't demean yourself," and they wrestled him to the ground. But that still didn't convince the treasurer. This was causing quite a commotion in the town. People were talking about it. And it happened that Mahamoggallana, one of the Buddha's chief disciples, together with another great arahant monk, Pindola Bharadvaja, were passing through. And they were standing together before they entered the village. They were standing together on top of a large rocky outcrop, putting their robe on and looking down at the village and the scene. And Pindola said to Mahamoggallana, I've heard that whoever can fly in the air and can take that bowl, it's unworthy to use psychic powers for such an end, but we could demonstrate the superiority of the Buddha's teaching, because none of these other ones can do it. You could easily fly up there and get it. And he said, well, so could you. Why don't you do it, Pindola? I'll leave this for you. Well, first Pindola performed another psychic feat. He caused the rocky outcrop they were on to float up in the air with him on it, and rode it over the town. So the whole town was covered by this big rock, and people became afraid, and they were hiding wherever they could, under window baskets and in their basements, and crying aloud, we'll be crushed, we'll be crushed. And with a flick of his foot, Pindola tossed the rock back to its proper place, and on his way down he grabbed the sandalwood bowl. So this then caused more people to talk, how wonderful, it's only the Buddha's disciples that can manifest these powers. But then the word got to the Buddha, and he called in Pindola for a dressing down. He said, is it true that you levitated in front of the multitude of people and took the sandalwood bowl? He said, yes, Lord, it is true. And the Buddha said, well, that's not the proper thing to do, and I'm going to lay down the rule now. And this is the moment at which the Vinaya rule was laid down, forbidding monks to display psychic power before the people. So the Buddha laid down the rule, monks are not allowed to display psychic powers. The Buddha didn't lay down the rules of the Vinaya all at once as an exercise in artificial rule making. It was more like case law. It would only when things came up, when somebody did something foolish or troublesome, then the Buddha would lay down a rule. In future, that's forbidden. So now this rule was laid down. There's a bit of a digression here from the main story to talk about the future career of Pindola. He was an arahant, which means he's fully enlightened. There's another story that at a later time the Buddha was traveling with some of his monks through the air to visit one of the heaven worlds, and Pindola came up to join them, and the Buddha scolded him and said, you've been told particularly not to do this. You abused the power in the past, and I told you not to do it. So now you're going to be punished by not being allowed to enter Parinibbana until the end of the kappa. This is kind of a legendary story that's like it's outside the main commentaries. So Pindola is said to be still wandering the earth. It's like the unwilling immortal. He can't enter Parinibbana. He's still stuck in human form till the end of the world age. And they say he's living in the royal palace in Bangkok, advising the kings. And in Thailand, it's like one of these urban legends that you hear someone say, well, I knew this other monk who told me he knew this guy from this other place that said that he went to a dana offering at the royal palace, and there was this long line of monks sitting waiting for the meal offering, and the ones at the very front, because we always sit in by seniority, how many years you've been ordained, you sit ahead of the others, and at the front of the line there'd be these wizened old men, like 90 or 100 years old, all bent over, and then this youngish looking fellow, looks like he's about 25 or 30, comes striding in and to the head of the line and sits himself down. So the story so far is that Pindola has performed this feat, and then the Buddha laid down this rule. Now the heretic teachers, in their discussions, they thought that they had found a way to take advantage of the situation. They said the Buddha's disciples are now forbidden to display psychic powers. None of them will display any psychic powers, so we can work any kind of trick and we'll impress people, and they won't be able to top us. So they began putting it about. The only reason that the Buddhist disciples say they've got this rule is because they can't do any psychic powers, but we can do all kinds of psychic powers. You should follow us. And the Buddha was talking with King Bimbisara of Magadha, and King Bimbisara reported this to him, that this was going around the town, and the Buddha said, well, tell the people that in 3 months' time, in the town of Sawati, I will work a great psychic miracle. And King Bimbisara said, but sir, I thought you laid down a rule. He said, and the Buddha said, I laid down this rule for my disciples, not for myself. And King Bimbisara said, well, is that right? And the Buddha said, let me give you an analogy, because sometimes people understand well from an analogy. You're a king of a kingdom that stretches over 20 yojanas, and here in Rajagaha you have a palace and a royal garden, and in the garden there are mango trees. What would happen if some people from the town come into your garden and start gathering the mango trees? Well, I'd have them punished, I'd have them flogged, I'd have them thrown out. But you can have the mango fruits anytime you want, can you not? Yes, of course. They're mine. I can have the mangoes anytime I want. The Buddha said, well, you rule over a kingdom of 60 yojanas, but I rule over 10,000 world systems. And my authority extends this far, and it is for me, this working of psychic powers and this dispensation, I reserve for myself. And you can tell the people that in 3 months' time in Sawati I will perform this great miracle. Sawati was a good distance away, and the reason the Buddha did that was so there would be sufficient time for people to assemble. And he began the next day walking towards Sawati. And the heretic teachers were now upset, but they said they couldn't give up trying to refute the Buddha, so they followed behind. And they were always like a half a day walk behind the Buddha. And they put it about that the Buddha and his disciples are scared of us. You see, they're always running away from us. And eventually the Buddha reached Sawati just before the beginning of the rains retreat. And the heretic teachers arrived a little bit later, and they raised money amongst their disciples, and they put up a big pavilion with fancy pillars and wreaths of flowers and all sorts of adornments. And they said, here we shall work our great miracle. And the Buddha announced that in 3 days' time he would work his miracle beneath Ganda's mango tree. So when the heretics heard this, they scurried about and they uprooted and tore up every mango tree for a yojana around, so that there would be no mango tree for the Buddha to work his miracle under. And then 3 days passed, and the morning of Salapuja, the king's gardener, whose name was Ganda, was out doing some work in the garden, and he came across the ant's nest. And these red ants in the tropics, they make these balls of leaves. And he found one of these and tore it apart and found it had been built around a ripe mango. And he said, I shall take this for the king's breakfast. And he started walking along with it. Then he passed by where the Buddha was, and he thought, I should give it to the Buddha instead. I will make a good merit. If I give it to the king, he might reward me with a few kahapanas of money. But if I give it to the Buddha, it'll have merit stored up for future lifetimes. So he offered it to the Buddha, and the Buddha passed it on to his attendant Ananda, and told Ananda to cut it up and make a drink out of it. So juice it up, so Ananda, mashed it up and mixed it with water and made a drink for the Buddha. The Buddha drank it, and then he said to Ganda, who was still there, the gardener, he said, take the mango seed and plant it there. And Ganda planted it in the ground, and then the Buddha had Ananda wash his hands, pour water over his hands while he rinsed his hands off. And the water, as soon as the water hit the ground where the mango seed was, it began to sprout. And within a few minutes, it was a full-grown, gorgeous, huge mango tree. and full of fruit. And the Buddha allowed for the monks and the people to come and take some fruit if they wished. And some people, after they'd eaten their mangoes, they pelted the heretics with the mango seeds and said, "Ha ha, you're foiled." And Sakka, the king of the gods, he saw what was going on, and he told Wesakamma, the architect or the builder of the gods, to make a pavilion for the Buddha and his disciples. So they made it a bigger, more beautiful pavilion for the Buddha. Then he had the wind god, Walahaka, blow a huge storm and tear up the heretics' pavilion and scatter it and cover the heretics in dust, and they ran away all like dirty and dusty and unhappy. And as they scattered, one of them, Purana, came across one of his disciples was coming to see the miracle he was expecting Purana would work, and he was walking along coming back from work, and he was carrying a heavy iron pot and a coil of rope. And Purana said, "Give me those things." And he said, "Well, I come to see you work a miracle." He says, "Fie with the miracles, just give me those things." And he took the rope and tied it around his own neck and tied the other end on the pot and threw it into the pond, and then thus came to his end. Now, back at Ganda's mango tree, the Buddha was waiting for the right moment, and people were gathering from all over to watch this feat, as well as Dewas from 10,000 world systems were assembling, expecting what will the Buddha do. And the Buddha had a circle around him of some of his disciples, and he said, "If I were to allow any of you to work the miracle instead of me, what would you do?" And various ones of his disciples spoke up, both monks and lay people. There was a lay woman who had third stage of enlightenment, an anagami, who said that if she was to work a miracle, she would fill the whole world up to the world-circling mountains with water, turn herself into a water bird, and appear here and there in the far north and the far west and so on. And the Buddha said, "Okay, anybody else, what would you do?" And there was a little novice, 7 years old, who said, "Well, if I was asked to do the miracle, what I would do is I would turn myself into a giant form of a Brahma god, and I would stomp on the earth and cause a great earthquake." Okay. And he asked various other ones what they would do, and there was a little girl novice who said she would take Mount Sinaru and Ugandhara mountain and Himalaya mountain and set them up in a row and turn herself into a bird and fly around them. After asking various people, then he asked, the master of psychic powers, his chief disciple Moggallana, "What would you do, Moggallana?" Moggallana said, "I would take all the people off the earth and all the beings, the people and animals, and put them in the palm of my hand so they'd be safe, and then I'd turn the earth over so that they could see the underside and eat the nutritious essence that is there." "Is there anything else you could do?" "Well, I could take Mount Sinaru and use it as a sunshade and walk about to and fro. Or I could grind it between my teeth like a kidney bean." Okay, I'm sure that would be very impressive. This great miracle is for me alone to perform. Just as in the past, I alone could bear the burden. And then he told a Jataka story of when he was, in previous lifetime, many aeons ago, he was a black bull who had been adopted by a farmer when the bull's mother was killed in a storm, and the farmer took in the bull and he treated it very well and spoiled it. It was like a pet. So there was a great affection between the farmer and the bull. When the bull became full grown, he thought, what can I do for this farmer to help him? And he had the power of speech. He told the farmer, "You make a bet with a rich merchant. Bet him 1,000 kahapanas that your bull can pull 100 fully loaded carts." "Well, no bull can do that. I can do that. You'll see." So he made a bet with this merchant for 1,000 kahapanas, and he tied the bull up to a row of 100 fully laden carts. And now the farmer was feeling kind of cocky, and he stood behind the bull and he hit him with a stick and said, "Move, you stupid brute, move." So the bull said, "I don't deserve this." And he just dug his feet into the ground and stood there, wouldn't move. So the farmer lost the bet, and he was in despair. He's ruined. And that night he's lying on his bed just in despair, and the bull pokes his head in the window and says, "What are you crying about?" He says, "What do you mean? You told me you'd pull those carts." And he says, "Well, why did you call me a brute and hit me with a stick?" "Oh, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't think. Okay, I'll give you another chance. Make a bet with that guy again tomorrow for double or nothing, 2,000 kahapanas." And then the next day they repeated the performance, and this time the farmer stroked the bull's flank and said, "My good friend, please help me. Please pull the carts." And the bull easily pulled the 100 carts, and the farmer won the bet. So that was a digression. The Buddha told this Jataka story to illustrate that he alone could bear this burden. As all the Buddhas from beginningless time, at some point in their career, they performed a twin miracle in front of the multitude. It's called the twin miracle. So as a preliminary, the Buddha set up a jeweled walkway from the western edge of the mountains on the western edge of the world to the mountains on the eastern edge of the world. And he walked to and fro on it, discoursing on the Dhamma. And he did a display with his rays, the 6 colored rays the Buddha can emit from his body, and he caused them to shine all the way up to the Brahma worlds and then curve back down again and create a great rainbow that covered 10,000 world systems. And then now the time came for the actual twin miracle. And the twin miracle is when the Buddha emits fire from one part of his body and water from another part, and he alternates very quickly, water from his upper part, fire from his lower part, and water from his left side, fire from his right side, and all sorts of variations. And why this is so amazing and only a Buddha can do it is because to emit fire from the body, one has to enter into 4th jhana on the fire element. And to emit water, one has to enter into 4th jhana on the water element. And only a Buddha can switch instantaneously. Not even Mahamoggallana could perform this feat of switching it from one manifestation to the other instantaneously in a single mind moment. So the Buddha demonstrated this, and then he asked himself, where do all the Buddhas from beginningless time, where do they spend the rainy season after performing the twin miracle? And he found the answer was they spend it in Tawatingsa heaven, which is the realm of the gods of the 33 on the top of Mount Sinnaru. So the Buddha announced he was now going to ascend to Mount Sinnaru, to the realm of the Tawatingsa gods for the rainy season. And he traveled there in 2 steps. He put one foot on top of the Yogandhara mountains, which are 42,000 yojanas high, and then the second step on the top of Mount Sinnaru, which is 84,000 yojanas high. And it was just like taking 2 ordinary steps. This is related to one of the 32 marks of the Buddha's body. Any Buddha is recognized by having 32 physical characteristics, and one of them is called the even and level tread. And it means that the entire sole of the foot evenly touches the ground at each step. So on a very superficial level, it means he's flat-footed. His sole is completely flat. But it also means when he walks on rough ground, the ground smooths itself before he puts his foot down. If there's any pebbles or twigs or little hollows in the ground, they smooth themselves. before his foot touches the ground. So when he cast out his foot with the intention of stepping it on Mount Ugandhara smoothed itself down to be under his foot. And then it rose up to its natural place, and he took the second step to the top of Mount Sinaru. So once he got up to Mount Sinaru, he was greeted with great rejoicing by the gods. And Sakka, the king of the gods of Tawatingsa, he rules from his throne, which is a great block, 60 yojanas by 40 yojanas, a great block of golden colored rock under the great Parichataka tree. And it's at the very summit of this earth system is the throne of Sakka. And Sakka wanted to offer the Buddha the honor of sitting on his throne to teach, but he thought to himself, these humans are so small. The gods are 3 gawutas tall, which is 3/4 of a yojana. So by our reckoning, they're 8 kilometers tall. So the Buddha is like a tiny little ant relative to the gods. And the Buddha knew the thought in Sakka's mind. And to put his mind at ease, he took his outer robe, his sangati, and he threw it over the throne, and it just fit. And then he climbed onto the throne, and he just fit perfectly. It was not a problem. And the Buddha's intention of going to teach at Tawatingsa was mostly to honor his mother, who had died 7 days after his birth and been reborn as a Dewa into Sita heaven, which was 2 heavens up from Tawatingsa. So she descended from Tusita heaven to Tawatingsa to listen to the teaching, and she took the seat of honor at his right side. And deities came from 10,000 world systems to assemble to listen to the Buddha's teachings. There's one story about 2 deities in particular amongst the first to arrive, Ankara and Indaka, and they both took seats near the Buddha. But as other deities arrived, and the deities arranged themselves in order of, not in order of seniority like the monks, but in order of merit. So that as more meritorious ones came, the less meritorious ones, the ones who had made less good karma in the past, they were pushed back. And Ankara kept his place close to the Buddha, but Indaka kept losing his seat and going further and further back. And the Buddha took this as an opportunity to make a little point about making merit. And he asked them to tell their stories of how they had made their merit to become Dewas in the first place. And Indaka had, in a period between Buddhas, he had lived as a human, and he had dedicated his life to making food offerings to anybody, any passers-by. And he had this big kitchen set up with like 12 pots of food, always ready, always boiling, and anyone who came he would offer them food. And Ankura, the one who kept his place close to the Buddha, he had been a human being more recently during the dispensation of the Buddha, and he had at one time given a single spoonful of gruel to Anuruddha, one of the enlightened Arahant monks. And the Buddha said this is an example of the power of the merit made. One of the factors it depends on is the worthiness of the recipient, and to give to a great Arahant is more powerful than to give to endless crowds of unenlightened people. So then the Buddha began his preaching that carried on for 3 months, uninterrupted, continuously. And this is the origin of the Abhidhamma. So what the Buddha taught in Tawatingsa heaven was the Abhidhamma teachings. And every day when it came time for his meal, he wouldn't interrupt his teaching. He created a Nimitta Buddha, which is like an illusory Buddha, an image of a Buddha, to sit and continue the preaching. So the Devas didn't even notice that any interruption. And he descended to earth. First he went to Uttarakuru, which is the wonderful magical continent in the far north, where the people live off the wish-fulfilling trees that provide them everything they need. And he would go for alms in Uttarakuru, and then he would go from there to Lake Anotata in the Himawant, magical lake. The water has great healing properties. Many stories about various kings and powerful beings seeking Anotata water. And he would go there to rinse his mouth and clean his bowl. There he would meet with Sariputta, his disciple reckoned to be the wisest of the disciples. And he would give Sariputta a brief summary of the teachings he had given the Devas the day before. And Sariputta then taught that to his 500 disciples. So this is the origin of the Abhidhamma as we have it. It's the brief synopsis of what the Buddhas taught the Devas as passed on to Sariputta. The 500 disciples of Sariputta, who were you could say the first school of Abhidhamma, they had been in a previous age, under the dispensation of Kassapa Buddha, they had been bats, 500 bats living in a cave, and 2 bhikkhus were staying in that cave for the rainy season, and they were, part of their practice was they would do walking meditation while reciting aloud from the Abhidhamma. And the bats heard this. They didn't understand human speech, but it moved something in their hearts, and when they died, they were all reborn in better conditions, and eventually they spent some time in the heavenly worlds, and they were eventually born as human beings at the time of the Buddha and Sariputta, and they became Sariputta's disciples. As the rainy season drew close to an end, all the people were still gathered at Savatthi. They had said they weren't going to leave until they saw the Buddha again. And they asked Moggallana, "Do you know when the teacher is coming back?" And Moggallana says, "Well, I don't know exactly. He said he'd be back at the end of the rainy season. I'll go and ask him." And Moggallana went up to Tawatingsa, and he did it this way so that the people could see him. First he dove into the earth, under the earth, and then he rose up through the center of Mount Sinaru, and he did it so that the people could see him as a golden thread rising up in the mountain. And when he reached the top of the mountain, he went to see the Buddha, and the Buddha said, "Yes, the rainy season ends in 3 days, and then I shall return to earth. Where will you alight on the earth?" And he said, "Where now is the elder Sariputta? He's residing at Samkasa, the town of Samkasa." "Well, that's where I shall come down." "Well, Lord, the great multitude of people are gathered at Savatthi, and it's in 3 days they can't make a 100 yojana journey to Sankasa." And he said, don't trouble them with that. Just tell them to set out on the morning of the end of the rainy season. Tell them to set out just as if they were going down the street to the next building, and they shall soon be at Sankasa. And then when the day came for the Buddha to leave the Tawatingsa heaven, Sakka prepared for the Buddha's descent. He prepared 3 staircases. The one in the center was jewels, the one on the right was gold, and the one on the left was silver. And they went all the way down from Tawatingsa heaven down to the foot was at the town of Sankasa in India. And the Buddha took the center staircase. The Devas descended on the right-hand golden staircase, and the Brahma gods descended on the left-hand silver staircase. The Buddha stood at the top of the stairs, And he looked up and he could see all the way up to the highest Brahma world. He could see all the 9 levels of Brahma gods. And he looked down, he could see all the way down to the lowest hell realm. And he looked to the right and the left and the fore and behind, and he could see all the other world systems, 10,000 world systems arrayed around. And he made it so that all the people assembled could see the devas, and all the devas could see the people. And he began to descend the staircase. And on his right-hand side was Panchasika, and on his left was Matali. These are 2 famous Gandhabas, heavenly musicians. Panchasika playing his vina, and Matali throwing flowers. Panchasika's vina, a vina is a stringed instrument, something like a sitar. And this had originally been Mara's. And Mara had followed the Buddha for a year after his enlightenment, hoping to find some flaw, and then he gave up in despair. And he was so broken that he dropped his vina before he disappeared. And Saka immediately snatched it up and gave it to Panchasika, his minstrel. And this wonderful vina has all kinds of magical properties. If you sound a string on this vina, it can continue the note for a full month. Matali is the charioteer of Saka. And Suyama, the king of the Yama gods, stood behind the Buddha as he descended, fanning him with a yak-tail fan. And Mahabrahma the Great stood behind, holding a white parasol over the Buddha. The white parasol in India was a symbol of sovereignty. It's kind of like in European royalty they have the crown, and Indian royalty they have the white parasol. It's a sign of the king's majesty. On state occasions, the king of Thailand still has the parasol held over his head. So the Buddha descended to the bottom, and all the people had arrived, just as he said. Miraculously, the journey was shortened, and they were all there to greet the Buddha when he descended from Tawatingsa heaven. And that spot was later marked with a great stupa. And this image of the Buddha descending on the jeweled staircases is one of the favorite motifs for art in Buddhist countries. They have it allows for a great elaboration of detail. You know, you can have the devas on one side, the Brahmas on the other, and all the jewels and parasol and so on. I've seen some really gorgeous wall paintings of that image. So that constitutes the story of the Buddha's teaching in Tawatingsa and the beginning of the Abhidhamma.